This week, of course, we're discussing empire during this period, and I want to stress one of the developments that's happened in the way empire during this period has been analyzed in the last 20 years or so. The fact that historians really look at empire and imperialism in this period as not being as something separate so much as integral to American history in this period. There was a time when we divided these things. There was domestic history and there was imperial history. Well, as you see from your reading in Edwards and in Fink, that's just no longer really the case. And I think that's a much more sophisticated, much more accurate way to look at, at things and for empire during this period. It's a much better way to conceptualize empire and empire building during this period. Now, what do I mean by this period? Well, during the 1880s and 1890s, America began to look beyond its borders. Now, this time, rather than looking west to the frontier, it cast an eye back to the old world. This young but quickly developing nation was about to embrace internationalism, or what some might call imperialism. So I want to examine here developments that convinced many Americans in the late 19th century that the United States needed to take a more aggressive role in world affairs. Then I'll explore specific manifestations of that new policy, in particular the Spanish American War and the building of the Panama Canal. Finally, I'll look at how internationalism or imperialism has shaped the nation's history since the early 20th century. The first thing I want to talk about is isolationism. As Americans, we're used to speaking of westward expansion when describing the territorial growth of the United States, but looked at from a different perspective, say from that of Native Americans or Mexicans, U.S. growth could easily be seen as a form of internationalism, even imperialism. The United States played hardball to seize, annex, and purchase large chunks of territory, including the Louisiana Territory, Florida, the Republic of Texas, and others. Thus, strictly speaking, the United States was hardly isolationist. Instead, Americans pursued a more narrowly defined form of isolationism that was based on two important ideas: that the nation should influence the world by example, and that it should avoid entanglement in European political and military affairs. And this is why we see the isolation of the type that occurs in the 20th century. The notion that America should avoid entanglement in European affairs stemmed from what was basically a fear of Europeanization, okay, which Americans associated with monarchy, with aristocracy, established churches, and fixed classes. Americans believe that these entrenched hierarchical political arrangements encourage endless wars among European powers. And it's not the worst argument to make. After all, European powers are at each other's throats for thousands of years, a couple thousands of years at least. The American form of isolationism was also based on the idea that the nation should influence the world by example. From the 1790s to the 1890s, Americans developed the belief that theirs was a nation with a special mission to spread the virtues of democracy and republican institutions. Nearly every American agreed, however, that the only way to accomplish this task was by example rather than by military intervention. Well, how does the United States then enter world affairs in a big way in this period? In the late 19th century, a series of converging ideas began to build a case for American internationalism, if not outright imperialism. These ideas included the closing of the American frontier, the threat to U.S. security from competing European powers, the American economy's need for new markets, militarism and the martial spirit, racism or the white man's burden, and idealism, the notion that a true republic must intervene to protect and promote liberty elsewhere. In 1890, the head of the U.S. Census Department announced that the American frontier was closed. The nation was finally settled from coast to coast. Some Americans celebrated this news, while others found it disturbing. To some, like historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who you're reading a lot in Fink and other places, the frontier experience had shaped America's unique political culture and ideas, such as individualism, entrepreneurship, democracy, and freedom. The frontier, in other words, was what turned Europeans into Americans. Did the closing of the frontier mean diminished democracy, reduced equality, weakened individualism, and the decline of the American Republic? Well, the answer from a rising group of internationalists was no. The United States simply needed to establish new frontiers by acquiring foreign territories around the globe. Doing so would ensure that future generations of Americans had the opportunity to experience the positive effects of the frontier. A second argument in favor of American internationalism focused on security from competing European powers. The late 19th century had seen European powers rapidly seizing colonies across Asia and Africa. This trend alarmed many Americans who wondered whether the United States was in danger of being shut out of the global marketplace or whether national security was at risk. Initially, most Americans resisted the idea of territorial conquest, but they increasingly supported the need for a strong U.S. Navy, which is the first sort of step. Another driver in America's transition was from isolationism to internationalism came from the economy's need for new markets. The country had experienced several periods of depression and recession, 1870s, 1890s, and many economists argued that the fundamental cause of economic booms and busts was overproduction. American factories produced more goods than the American public could ever consume. One solution was to find new markets abroad, either through increased trade or, following the European example, through the acquisition of foreign territories where you could sort of force trade. Yet another idea that supported a more aggressive role in the world affairs for the United States emanated from a small but influential number of Americans led by Theodore Roosevelt. They were worried that because it had been several generations since the Civil War, the average American male was growing soft and effeminate. The United States needed a war to renew its masculine vigor. And they're talked about this in exactly those terms, using exactly those terms in that language. The next argument for internationalism originated as a justification for British colonialism and was appropriated by the United States. This justification was the dark races of the world live in savagery. Therefore, the imperial powers must take up, quote, the white man's burden of ruling them and seeing that their natural resources were put to productive use. But by far the most popular argument for American internationalism was the idealistic notion that the United States had an obligation to protect and promote Republican liberty through the use of military power. According to this argument, the tradition of simply showcasing democracy and human rights to the world was inadequate. It might have been appropriate when America was a small, weak republic, but now that it was an emerging world power, the nation had the moral obligation to use that power to promote democracy and human rights. This was a largely abstract issue until the mid-1890s, when a very real example of tyranny attempting to crush democracy and human rights began to unfold in Cuba, as you hear again and again, only 90 miles off the tip of Florida. And this is where we get to, of course, the Spanish-American War. Cuba was controlled by Spain and was the last major European colony in Latin America. Since the 1860s, Cuban nationalists had been pushing for independence. The nationalists staged a rebellion against Spanish colonial rule in 1868 that lasted for 10 years before it was crushed. 17 years later, in 1895, they launched a second rebellion, relying primarily on guerrilla tactics. The Spanish replied harshly. The most notorious policy was the establishment of reconcentration camps into which a great number of Cuban civilians were herded to separate them from the rebels. A lack of adequate food and sanitation caused the deaths of tens of thousands of these Cuban civilians. President William McKinley's administration pressured the Spanish to end human rights violations, but these efforts were largely ineffective. Then, on February 15th, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. The explosion was likely the result of a boiler accident, but American public opinion became convinced that it had been the result of some sort of Spanish treachery. On April 11th, after only a few weeks of diplomatic pressure on the Spanish, McKinley requested the Congress from Congress the authority to use force in Cuba. And 2 weeks later, on April 25th, 1898, Congress declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was the shortest and most one-sided conflict in U.S. history. Hundreds of thousands of American men volunteered for military service, including Theodore Roosevelt, who raised his own regiment and participated in the invasion of Cuba. One of the most interesting things about Roosevelt was the fact that his famous Rough Riders, who were so instrumental in the Battle of San Juan in early July 1898, was that they were named the Rough Riders after the Buffalo Bill Wild West Act called Rough Riders. So there's sort of a conscious naming of the Rough Riders after a circus show. Okay, but even before that offensive took place, the United States scored a major victory halfway around the world in the Philippines. This is what we always forget. The Spanish-American War is about Cuba, but it's also about the Philippines. The Philippines was a Spanish colony, vast collection of islands in the Pacific, and it held great strategic value. U.S. expansionists and business interests were eager to gain access to the lucrative markets of Asia and Australasia, right? Australia and New Zealand, and the Philippines is perfectly positioned. And the U.S. Navy saw the Philippines as a valuable refueling station for its Pacific fleet. As a result, only a week after America declared war against Spain related to their competing interest in Cuba, Commodore George Dewey led the Pacific Fleet into Manila Bay and quickly destroyed an overmatched Spanish fleet. U.S. troops landed soon thereafter to secure American possession of the islands. 2 months later, the American Army began its assault on Cuba. The first troops landed on June 22nd and managed to defeat Spanish forces in a matter of weeks. On August 12, 1898, both sides signed a ceasefire, ending all hostilities. In the treaty that followed, the United States acquired control of Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Suddenly, the young republic had become an imperial power. But the United States soon discovered that imperialism was a complicated business. For example, didn't Republican values dictate that America should grant independence to the people of the former Spanish colonies? Ultimately, a desire to retain strategic territories and control their resources led the U.S. government to deny full independence and democratic freedom to Cubans, to Puerto Ricans, and to Filipinos. Now, finally, I want to talk about the building of the Panama Canal, because it's not only interesting in itself, but it shows us a lot about this overall drive towards empire. The first attempt to cut a canal across the Isthmus of Panama to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific in what was then part of the country of Colombia was undertaken actually by the French. It failed in 1888 after 9 years of work. 13 years later, soon after becoming sworn in as president, Theodore Roosevelt declared his intention to complete the canal. But when members of Roosevelt's administration began negotiations with the Colombians regarding financial compensation, things got sticky. The administration offered $40 million for the right to build and operate the canal, plus a $250,000 annual fee. But the Colombian Congress refused that deal, arguing that the price was far too low given the value of the asset. Teddy Roosevelt grew furious and denounced the Colombians as extortionists. Well, behind the scenes, though, the Roosevelt administration encouraged the Panamanians, right, to declare their independence from Colombia, and the Roosevelt administration offered promises of U.S. military assistance. Now, this scheme worked perfectly. On November 4th, 1903, Panamanians declared independence, and when the Colombian government tried to send troops to suppress the movement, the U.S. Navy prevented the ships from landing. 2 days later, the United States recognized Panamanian independence, and 12 days after that, the two governments, that is the U.S. government and the new Panamanian government, signed a treaty allowing the United States to build a canal for $10 million plus an annual fee of $250,000. Construction soon started, and in August 1915, the canal opened for business. Now, if you're at all interested in the technology and the engineering of all this, I highly recommend a book called The Path Between the Seas, and I'll talk about it in our discussion. With a precedent of internationalism and intervention established in Cuba and Colombia, and frankly also in the Philippines, America left behind forever the idea of influencing world affairs by merely setting a good example. It would now embrace interventionism as a central aspect of U.S. foreign policy. Isolationism would never go away completely, but from 1898 to the present, the country has viewed itself as an international power.